A millionaire marries an ugly beggar woman on a bet, but what he discovers the next day shocks him. Nathaniel Nate Hartfield, his name echoed through Manhattan as a synonym for power and extravagance. A real estate mogul renowned for turning any scrap of land into gold. Nate was also a man who radiated arrogance. Owner of an immeasurable fortune, he firmly believed that everything in life had a price, even those things that were said to be priceless. This unshakable confidence was often put to the test during the luxurious nights he spent with his friends in exclusive penthouses, indulging in expensive whiskey and shallow conversations. It was during one of these evenings that an unlikely bet emerged. Before continuing, make sure to subscribe to the channel so we can reach our goal of 1,000 subscribers. Nate was reclining in a leather armchair as the others laughed and joked about the extravagances they had witnessed in one another. The jokes soon turned toward Nate, the man who could conquer anything but seemed incapable of engaging with something genuine beyond money. He took the comments with a restrained smile, unbothered, until one of his friends, a sharp-tongued Wall Street broker, threw down the challenge. "You think you can buy anything, Hartfield, but could you convince someone to do something truly outrageous? Tell me, would you have the guts to marry someone nobody would ever choose?" The room erupted in laughter, but Nate, his ego slightly pricked, maintained his composure. He never backed down from a challenge. Never. With a slow sip of his whiskey, he responded with icy confidence. "Everything has a price. Everything." The laughter shifted to exclamations of disbelief. Another friend chimed in, insisting the idea was madness, but Nate had already made up his mind. The bet was sealed. He was to find someone whose appearance, status, and circumstances were so undesirable that no man would consider marrying her. And as part of the bet, he had to convince her to say yes. The prize? It wasn't money. Nate had no need for that. What he wanted was to prove his superiority, to reaffirm his belief that the world revolved around the power money could wield. Outwardly, he seemed unbothered, but inwardly, a spark of anxiety began to grow. This wasn't just about ego. It was the perfect opportunity to reassert his dominance in a world where everyone competed to be the best. He knew that by taking on this challenge, he wouldn't just bolster his reputation among his friends. He'd prove something to himself. He always had control of everything. Or so he believed. Manhattan was gripped by a biting cold. The city, with its dazzling lights and relentless pace, seemed indifferent to the lost souls seeking refuge in the shadows of its towering buildings. Nate, wrapped in his impeccable wool coat, walked along the sidewalk toward his car, but his mind was consumed by the bet. He needed to find someone who was the complete opposite of everything he knew, the kind of person his elite circle would never even notice, or worse, someone they would openly scorn. While waiting for his driver to bring the car, something caught Nate's attention. At the corner, crouched under a makeshift cardboard shelter, was a woman. Her disheveled hair fell over her face, partially covered by a grimy scarf. Her oversized, worn-out clothes barely managed to conceal the pitiable state of her condition. There was a stillness about her, an almost resigned air that set her apart from the chaos of the city around her. Nate, driven by a nearly cruel curiosity, approached. With every step closer, more details came into view. Her skin bore the marks of time and the relentless hardships of street life. When her eyes finally met his, they carried a depth he hadn't anticipated. There was something disarming in that gaze, a blend of defiance and vulnerability that left him unsettled. "It's cold tonight," he began, attempting not to sound insensitive, though his tone betrayed just that. The woman looked him up and down, her gaze sharp and appraising, as though she could see beyond the expensive suit and the watch likely worth more than she would see in her lifetime. After a long, pointed silence, she replied in a hoarse voice tinged with subtle sarcasm. "Don't say." Nate let out a dry chuckle. She was precisely what he was looking for. Someone who would never be chosen. Someone so far removed from his world that the thought of marrying her bordered on absurdity. And yet, There was something about her that made him uneasy, as though he were stepping into unknown territory. "What's your name?" he asked, ignoring the biting cold that stung his face. "Lucy. And yours?" "Not that it matters." He tilted his head, taken aback by her bluntness. There was more to her than met the eye. Nate then made his proposal. "What if I could change your life? Give you a place to live, new clothes, hot meals every day?" Lucy furrowed her brow. She was no stranger to empty promises and dubious motives, but something about this man suggested he was different. Not better, just different. "And what do you want in return?" she asked, crossing her arms as if bracing herself for the worst. Nate hesitated for a moment, knowing he needed to be upfront. She wasn't someone who could be swayed with sugar-coated words. "I want you to marry me." The silence that followed was so thick it seemed to swallow the city's background noise. Lucy raised an eyebrow, both surprised and suspicious at the same time. "Marry? You?" She laughed, a bitter, raspy sound. "You're joking, right?" "I'm not. It's a deal. You'll have security, comfort, and stability for 1 year. After that, we go our separate ways." "Nothing but a contract." Lucy studied him, weighing not only his words but his intentions. Part of her was too worn down to resist, yet there was still a flicker of fight in her eyes. She knew he wasn't the savior she had once dreamed of, but perhaps he was her only way out at that moment. 1 year, she asked, her voice low, tinged with doubt. 1 year, Nate confirmed firmly. She closed her eyes for a moment, as though calculating the risks. When she opened them again, her expression held an unexpected calm. "Fine, I'll do it." Nate couldn't tell if he felt relief or a faint pang of discomfort. There was something about this woman that hinted at a story far bigger than he had anticipated. But for now, all that mattered was that he had taken the first step toward winning the bet. What he didn't yet realize was that this decision would change his life in ways he could never foresee. Nathaniel Hartfield was a man well-versed in contracts. Every page he signed, every clause he negotiated, was a reminder that control was a currency far more valuable than money. The agreement with Lucy would be no different. Before even considering walking down the aisle, he called on his lawyers to draft a detailed contract. The language had to be precise, the terms unyielding. There would be no room for misunderstandings or emotional complications. The morning after his encounter with Lucy, Nate met her at a discreet cafe, far from prying eyes. She looked out of place in the cushioned chair, as though the ambience, with its soft music and the aroma of freshly brewed coffee, wasn't meant for someone like her. He noticed her hands trembling slightly as she held her cup, though her face remained neutral, almost defiant. "Before anything else, you need to understand the terms," Nate began, placing a sleek black leather folder on the table. "This isn't a traditional marriage. It's a contract, a mutual agreement. You'll have everything you need, a comfortable home, clothes, food, money. But there will be no emotional involvement." Lucy raised her eyes to meet his, a faint, cynical smile tugging at her lips. "Emotional involvement? Like that's even a real risk." Nate ignored the jab and continued, opening the folder and sliding the contract toward her. Each paragraph was a fortress, meticulously constructed to safeguard his intentions and, most importantly, his pride. He explained that she would need to spend 1 year by his side, pretending to be his wife at minimal public appearances while avoiding unnecessary contact with his personal life. In return, she would gain access to a lifestyle she could never have imagined. 1 year of luxury and then we move on. You'll have the freedom to do whatever you want with your life. Lucy flipped through the contract, her eyes skimming over the words, even though she knew none of it made sense to her. Legal jargon and formal language were a world apart, but even without understanding everything, she could feel the weight of the agreement. It wasn't just a document. It was a surrender, a pact between two people who didn't trust each other. "And what if I change my mind?" she asked, not lifting her gaze from the pages. There won't be any changing your mind. Nate's voice was firm, almost cold. You have my word that I'll uphold my side. And I expect the same from you. Lucy closed the folder with a sharp motion and stared at him. There was something in her eyes that challenged his composure, as if she were silently warning him he was playing with fire. This isn't a contract, it's a sale, she said, tilting her head slightly. But it looks like I don't have much to lose, do I? Nate didn't respond. He knew that for her, this contract represented more than security. It was an escape from something he couldn't yet understand. But her motives didn't concern him. All that mattered was that she agreed. She picked up the pen he'd placed on the table and, with a decisive gesture, signed the contract. Nate felt a strange sense of relief but also a pang of unease. Lucy wasn't the submissive figure he'd expected. She carried something within her that he couldn't quite pinpoint, and it unsettled him. So that's it. We're officially stuck with each other for a year, Lucy said, placing the pen back on the table with a light but deliberate touch. Nate leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. Don't think of it as being stuck. Think of it as a mutually beneficial arrangement. Lucy let out a low, humorless laugh. Call it whatever you want. As they left the cafe, Nate watched Lucy walk away, her shoulders still tense and her posture defiant. He believed he had everything under control. But in that moment, something about her, maybe that cynical smile or the eyes that seemed to hide endless secrets, made him briefly wonder if he was stepping into a game he didn't fully understand. The wedding took place on a gray morning in a hidden chapel in the heart of Manhattan. The location had been strategically chosen by Nate, who wanted to avoid any public exposure. There were no photographers, no flowers adorning the altar, and the only sound was the echo of footsteps on the worn marble floor. Everything felt devoid of emotion, as if it were just another cold, calculated transaction, an extension of the contract they had both signed. Lucy arrived wearing a simple white dress Nate had arranged for her to buy. Though expensive, the design made no effort to flatter her figure or draw attention. She looked uncomfortable, her shoulders stiff and her gaze fixed on the ground as she held a modest bouquet, an arrangement that seemed as out of place as she did in that setting. Nate, on the other hand, wore an immaculate suit, but his expression was one of complete detachment. There was no trace of joy or nervousness, only the same arrogance he wielded like a shield. The officiant, an elderly man with a kind demeanor, read the customary words but appeared puzzled by the coldness of the couple. He hesitated briefly before asking if they were both there of their own free will, as though he could sense something was off about the union. Lucy gave a slight nod in response, while Nate, too impatient for formalities, merely muttered a curt yes. When it came time to exchange vows, Nate made no effort to conceal his disdain for the moment. His words were rehearsed, almost mechanical, as he slipped the ring onto Lucy's finger. She, in turn, held his hand firmly, though her voice trembled slightly as she repeated her vows. For someone who had endured the hardships of street life, this should have been easy, but the formality of the act weighed on her in an entirely different way. At the end of the ceremony, when the officiant declared them officially married, an awkward silence fell over the room. Nate avoided looking at Lucy and immediately stepped away, making it clear this was nothing more than the fulfillment of a bet. Lucy remained still for a moment, staring at the ring on her finger as if it were a foreign object. Her lips formed a fragile, almost imperceptible smile before she followed him out of the chapel. In the limousine taking them back to Nate's luxurious apartment, the silence was nearly unbearable. Lucy, sitting in the far corner, stared out the window, watching the tall buildings blur past. Nate was engrossed in his phone, completely ignoring her presence, though he occasionally cast furtive glances in her direction. There was something in her posture that he couldn't quite decipher. She appeared calm, yet there was a tension in the air, as if she were holding something back. When they arrived at the apartment, Nate gestured hurriedly for her to enter. The space was monumental, with panoramic views of the city, sleek modern furniture, and abstract art adorning the walls. Lucy's eyes scanned the room, taking everything in silently. It was the complete opposite of everything she had ever known. Yet it didn't feel welcoming. There was a coldness in the air, a sense of emptiness that seemed to mirror Nate himself. He left her in the guest room without even showing her where the master bedroom was. Before stepping out, he delivered a final remark that carried both indifference and a thinly veiled warning. "Remember the contract. No crossing boundaries." Lucy only nodded, but as soon as the door closed, she let out a heavy sigh. She sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the pristine white walls. She knew she had entered into a complicated arrangement, but there was something about Nate's cold demeanor that intrigued her. He was a man of many masks, and though she didn't yet know why, she felt compelled to uncover what lay beneath them. That night, they both went to bed in separate rooms, but the weight of the day hung over them like a shadow. For Nate, it was just another victory to tally. For Lucy, it was the beginning of something she couldn't yet understand, but somehow, she sensed it would change everything. The wedding night arrived, but for Nate, it was merely another obligation within the confines of their agreement. He prepared to maintain as much distance from Lucy as possible. However, the night took a turn he never could have anticipated. While Lucy remained in the guest room, Nate passed the time in his apartment's office. A glass of whiskey sat untouched on the desk as he reviewed contracts on his laptop, trying to ignore the discomfort of knowing there was someone else in his home, someone he had brought into his life for a reason as trivial as a bet. When the clock struck midnight, he decided to call it a night. He stood, turned off the lights, and walked down the hallway toward his bedroom. On the way, something caught his attention. The door to the guest room was slightly ajar, and a faint light spilled through the gap. Nate hesitated, but curiosity pulled him closer. He knocked lightly on the door, waiting for Lucy to respond, but no sound came. Finally, he pushed the door open slowly. Lucy was lying on the bed, her arms above her head as if trying to relax, but her rigid posture betrayed otherwise. She wore a simple nightgown Nate had arranged for her, a modest, unassuming piece that revealed parts of her skin. That was when he noticed the marks. His gaze fell on her arms, her legs, her neck. Irregular scars and the faint traces of old cuts, some deep, others more subtle, formed a map of a history he didn't know. There were faded tattoos as well, symbols that seemed to hold hidden meanings, like coded messages from a past she preferred to leave behind. Lucy became aware of his presence and quickly sat up, pulling the sheet over her body. Their eyes met, hers flashing a mixture of anger and shame, while his were filled with sheer surprise. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. "What are you staring at?" she asked, her voice low but heavy with an emotion he couldn't quite place. Nate shook his head, trying to appear indifferent, but he couldn't tear his eyes away from the scars. "What are those marks?" he asked bluntly, though his voice came out softer than he had intended. Lucy clutched the sheet against her chest, as if it could shield her not just from Nate, but from something far bigger. For a moment, it seemed she wouldn't answer. Then, after taking a deep breath, she spoke, her gaze fixed elsewhere. "Nothing that matters to you." Nate frowned. He wasn't the type of man who tolerated evasions, but something about the way she said it made him pause. For the first time, he realized Lucy was more than she appeared to be. She wasn't just a homeless woman he had picked to fulfill a bet. She carried something within her, a pain, perhaps a secret, that made her far more complex than he had anticipated. Without saying another word, Nate stepped back, allowing the door to remain slightly ajar. But before he left completely, he cast one last look at Lucy. She was staring at him now, her eyes filled with defiance but with a glimmer of vulnerability he hadn't noticed before. "Good night, Lucy," he said, his tone laced with an unexpected gentleness that felt foreign even to him. She didn't respond, merely turning her face away as she lay back down. Nate closed the door and returned to his room, but the image of her stayed with him throughout the night. He couldn't stop thinking about the scars, the tattoos, the marks. Who was Lucy Green, really? And what had happened to her to leave her in such a state? Lying in bed, Nate felt something he hadn't in years, a sense that something was beyond his control. The bet he had thought so simple was beginning to reveal layers he hadn't foreseen. For the first time, he wondered if he'd made a mistake in underestimating Lucy Green. The next morning began with an odd atmosphere in the apartment. Nate woke up earlier than usual, his mind still tangled in the events of the previous night. He found himself distracted, letting his coffee grow cold in its mug. Something about the way Lucy had reacted, the silent pain hidden in her eyes, unsettled him more than he cared to admit. For Nate, life had always been an equation of control and outcomes. But Lucy didn't fit into his rules, and it disarmed him. Lucy appeared in the kitchen not long after, wearing one of the outfits Nate had arranged for her. It was simple yet well-fitted, giving her an appearance she didn't seem entirely comfortable presenting. Her steps were light, almost silent, as if she were trying to go unnoticed. She poured herself some coffee without looking at Nate, but he couldn't help but notice her. There was something about her that drew him in, not in an obvious way, but like a puzzle he felt compelled to solve. Nate wasn't one to let uncomfortable silences linger, so he decided to address it head-on. "About last night," he began, but Lucy cut him off immediately. "I don't want to talk about it." Her voice was firm but not hostile, as if she were accustomed to deflecting unwelcome questions. Nate raised his hands in a gesture of surrender, though his curiosity only deepened. He knew pressing her now wouldn't get him anywhere, so he chose a different approach. "All right, we won't talk about it, but I want you to know I'm not the kind of person who—" He hesitated, searching for the right words. "Who invades people's privacy without reason." Lucy let out a short, bitter laugh, as though the idea of Nate being respectful was utterly absurd. She looked at him over her coffee mug with an ironic smile. "You proposed to me as part of a bet. Let's be clear. Privacy isn't exactly your priority." Her words struck Nate deeper than he expected. He was silent for a moment, realizing how easily she could see through the masks he wore. It was disconcerting, but also captivating. Lucy was unlike anyone he had ever met, and that intrigued him more than he cared to admit. After Lucy left the kitchen, Nate found himself wandering through the apartment. When he reached the guest room, his curiosity got the better of him. He knew she had brought very few belongings, but one item in particular caught his attention. A small, time-worn journal with a scratched leather cover. It was on the nightstand, partially hidden beneath a scarf. Nate hesitated. He knew he was crossing a line, but the urge to uncover the mystery surrounding Lucy pushed him forward. Carefully, he picked up the journal and opened it to the first page, where a name was written in delicate handwriting. Lucy Margaret Green. The contrast between the elegant script and the woman he knew was striking. Flipping through a few pages, he found fragmented notes, some nearly illegible, as though they had been scribbled in haste. One passage caught his eye and left him unsettled. "I need to keep moving. They might find me. I can't trust anyone." Nate frowned, trying to make sense of it. Who were they? What was Lucy running from? Another passage mentioned an accident, but the words were scribbled over, as though she had regretted writing them. Before he could read more, he heard footsteps approaching. Quickly, he returned the journal to its place and left the room, doing his best to appear nonchalant. Lucy appeared in the hallway and watched him for a moment, suspicion etched on her face. "Something wrong?" she asked, crossing her arms. "No, nothing," he replied, trying to sound casual. "I was just thinking about what we'll need to organize for your new routine." Lucy didn't seem convinced, but she didn't press further. She gave a slight nod and returned to her room. As the door closed, Nate exhaled deeply, a wave of guilt and unease washing over him. Whatever Lucy was hiding, it was something significant, something that kept her on edge, even in the comfort of luxury. For the first time, Nate felt that this bet was far more than he had bargained for. The days that followed marked the beginning of a transformation that surprised everyone. Most of all, Nate. Lucy, now immersed in a world that had never been hers, began adapting to her new reality in unexpected ways. At first, she seemed out of place in the luxurious settings Nate introduced her to. The idea of visiting high-end salons, trying on custom-made clothes, and dining at Michelin-starred restaurants felt almost laughable to her. Yet, little by little, Lucy started to adjust. The first noticeable change was in her appearance. Nate had hired a personal consultant to guide her, but Lucy, determined as ever, took control of the process. She had her long, disheveled hair cut into modern, sleek layers, giving her a polished and confident look. Her worn-out clothes were replaced with elegant pieces that subtly highlighted her figure without being ostentatious. Her skin, once weary and dull, began to glow with newfound vitality, and even her eyes seemed different, brighter, more alert. Nate noticed that while many saw these changes as purely cosmetic, there was something deeper happening. Lucy wasn't just altering her appearance. She was rediscovering parts of herself that had long been buried. She also surprised everyone with how quickly she adapted to Nate's world. At dinners and social events where she once sat silently, Lucy now spoke with confidence. She observed the people around her, learning to navigate high society with an almost innate skill. Her sharp intelligence and measured sarcasm began to win over those who had initially dismissed her. Nate watched from a distance, intrigued. He had expected Lucy to simply follow the rules of their contract and remain in the background. Instead, she was doing more than that. She was thriving in her own unique way. One particular moment stood out to Nate. He had arranged a dinner at his penthouse for a group of investors. Lucy, seated beside him, seemed calm and poised as the others engaged in conversation. At one point, a guest made a disparaging joke, implying that women like Lucy didn't belong in such refined settings. Nate prepared to intervene, but before he could say a word, Lucy responded with calm precision. "It's funny," she said, leaning forward slightly, her tone light but sharp. "Some people think money buys sophistication, but in the end, it's character that determines who truly belongs anywhere." The comment, delivered with a smile, cut through the room like a blade. The guest choked on his wine while the others laughed nervously, unsure how to react. Nate, rarely caught off guard, felt a strange twinge of pride. Lucy wasn't just surviving in this world. She was beginning to own it in a way he hadn't anticipated. And yet, there was something in Lucy that never seemed to change, a shadow that lingered over her. No matter how much she smiled or engaged in conversation, Nate noticed that at night, when she thought no one was watching, she still seemed to carry an invisible weight. Sometimes, he would catch her staring out the window, as if expecting something or someone to appear at any moment. That hidden vulnerability only deepened Nate's curiosity. He was beginning to realize that the contract binding them was merely the surface of something far more profound. Lucy, on the other hand, was also noticing changes in Nate. He was no longer the cold, detached man who had approached her on the streets. His glances held something more, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. Perhaps it was fascination with her transformation, but there was also a hint of care, an interest he seemed hesitant to acknowledge. Lucy knew she couldn't trust him. She couldn't trust anyone. Really? But, against her better judgment, she found herself wondering if the wall between them was as impenetrable as she once believed. As days turned into weeks, Lucy continued to thrive in her new world. Yet deep down, she knew it was all temporary. It was only a matter of time before the past, always lurking in the shadows, found a way to catch up with her. And though she tried to keep up appearances, there were moments when even the luxury and security Nate had provided felt fragile in the face of what she knew was coming. Then came the grand evening. Nate had been invited to a charity gala, an event where New York's elite gathered to showcase their donations and, more importantly, their influence. Lucy, now accustomed to moving in such circles, stood by his side. She wore an elegant navy blue dress with a flawless cut that enhanced her presence in a subtle yet undeniable way. Her posture was steady, her expression confident, but Nate, who had started to decipher even the smallest details of her emotions, noticed a faint tension beneath the surface. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, like a taut wire ready to snap. The evening seemed to unfold within the expected norms. Champagne flowed in crystal flutes, soft laughter filled the room, and conversations about business and philanthropy buzzed across the tables. Lucy stood next to Nate, greeting people as he introduced her. Her sharp, insightful remarks had become something of a trademark, impressing those who once dismissed her. She didn't just surprise them, she commanded their respect, something Nate quietly admired. But everything changed during dessert. Lucy was deep in conversation with a socialite about contemporary art when her entire demeanor shifted. Her eyes froze, her champagne glass halted midway to her lips, and the smile on her face vanished. Nate, standing beside her, noticed immediately. He followed her gaze, scanning the room, but at first, he saw nothing out of the ordinary. The ballroom was filled with elegantly dressed guests, none of them appearing remotely threatening. And yet, Lucy's reaction told a different story. "Lucy, are you all right?" Nate asked quietly, leaning slightly toward her. She didn't answer. Her breathing had quickened, though she was clearly trying to keep her composure. Finally, Nate followed her gaze again and noticed a man standing across the ballroom. He was tall, with neatly trimmed gray hair and a dark suit that made him look as seamlessly at home in this setting as anyone else. But there was something about his stance, the way his eyes locked onto Lucy, that sent a wave of unease through Nate. "Who is he?" Nate asked, his voice lower now, but laced with urgency. Lucy abruptly turned to Nate, as if just realizing he was there. Her eyes were wide, and it was clear she was battling a rising panic. After a few seconds, she shook her head. "No one. It's nothing." Nate didn't believe her for a second. He could see the fear in every movement, in the way she clutched her champagne glass as if it were her only anchor. Resolute, he placed a firm hand on her arm and guided her out of the ballroom, away from the curious eyes of the crowd. In the quiet corridor, Lucy finally seemed to catch her breath, though she still didn't speak. Nate watched her, his impatience growing. "Lucy, you need to tell me what's going on. Who was that man?" She hesitated, biting her lower lip. Her eyes were filled with something Nate couldn't entirely decipher. Fear, shame, or perhaps both. At last, she whispered, "He's someone I hoped I'd never see again." Nate narrowed his eyes, trying to grasp the weight of her words. He had always known Lucy carried a dark past, but this felt more immediate, more tangible than he had imagined. "Is he threatening you?" Nate asked, his voice deep and steady. Lucy averted her gaze but didn't answer. Nate felt a surge of frustration mixed with concern. He knew she didn't fully trust him, but he also couldn't ignore what had just happened. The man in the ballroom wasn't a coincidence, and Lucy's reaction was a clear signal that there was much more to her story than she had let on. After a long moment of silence, Lucy finally looked up at Nate. Her voice was steadier now, though still quiet. "Please don't ask any questions right now. Just let me handle this." Nate wanted to push back, to insist that she explain everything right then and there, but something in her expression stopped him. There was a weight in her eyes, something he couldn't quite put into words, but it told him that forcing her wouldn't help. "All right, but this isn't over," he said finally, his voice softer. Lucy nodded slowly but remained silent. Nate felt a mix of frustration and something unfamiliar, an urge to protect her, even though he didn't fully understand why. As he guided her back to the ballroom, he knew this moment would mark the beginning of something much bigger. The pieces of Lucy's past were starting to surface, and he was determined to uncover what was hidden beneath them, even if it meant breaking the rules of their contract. It was the early hours of the morning when Lucy woke up abruptly. The room, though silent, felt suffocating. The memory of the man she had seen at the dinner lingered in her mind like a shadow she couldn't shake. She ran her hand through her hair, now neatly styled but tangled from restless sleep. The sense of safety she had started to cultivate since entering Nate's world was unraveling fast. Her past, the one she had fought so desperately to bury, was beginning to resurface. The vibration of her phone jolted her from her thoughts. Lucy stared at the screen, her heart pounding. Only a few people had that number, and no one she knew should be calling at that hour. Reluctantly, she answered. The voice on the other end was cold, sharp like a blade. "Did you think you could disappear, Lucy? Did you think I'd never find you?" Her breath caught, and for a moment, she couldn't respond. That voice was unmistakable. It was him, the man who had ruined her life, the same man she had seen at the dinner. He hadn't just found her. He was making it clear he wouldn't stop until he had her cornered. "What do you want?" she finally managed to ask, her voice trembling more than she would have liked. "I want what's mine. You know exactly what I'm talking about. And don't think you can hide behind that new husband of yours. He has no idea who you really are. Does he? But I do. I know everything." Lucy felt the ground fall away beneath her. He knew. He had always known. No matter how far she ran, he had always been one step ahead. Her silence seemed to agitate him further. "Consider this your warning, Lucy. Either you do what I say, or I'll make sure everyone knows the truth, including your protector. Let's see how he reacts when he finds out who you really are." Before she could respond, the line went dead. Lucy sat frozen on the bed, gripping the phone as if it might explode in her hands. Her mind was a whirlwind of chaos. The threat was clear, but what terrified her most was the thought of involving Nate. He wasn't part of this story, and she was determined to keep it that way. However, Nate wasn't someone who could be easily fooled. He was in his office when he heard the faint sound of Lucy's door opening. His senses, already on high alert since the dinner, made him stand up immediately. He knew something was wrong, and Lucy's expression as she stepped out of her room only confirmed his suspicions. She was pale, her eyes fixed on the floor as though she carried a burden too heavy to bear. "Lucy," his voice came out firmer than he had expected. "What's going on?" She froze in place, her hands still clutching her phone. For a moment, it looked as though she might collapse, but she quickly straightened her posture, lifting her chin in defiance. "Nothing that concerns you, Nate. I'm fine." He crossed his arms, his gaze locking onto hers with intensity. "No, you're not. Since last night, you've been different. You're scared, Lucy. And if there's one thing I can't stand, it's being kept in the dark by someone living under my roof." Lucy swallowed hard. She knew Nate wouldn't accept a vague answer, but the thought of telling him the truth was even more terrifying. After a few seconds, she averted her gaze. "It's something from my past. I can handle it. I just need time." Her response didn't satisfy Nate. He took a step closer, reducing the distance between them. "No, I'm not going to stand by while something or someone threatens you. If there's something I need to know, you'd better tell me now." Lucy felt his words strike a fragile chord within her. For the first time, someone was putting themselves between her and the danger she faced. It was comforting, but it also felt dangerously risky. She took a deep breath, trying to collect her thoughts. "I can't tell you everything, Nate. Not yet. But you have to trust me. Just, please, give me the space to deal with this." Nate was silent for a moment, his eyes scanning her face, searching for answers she wasn't ready to give. He realized that pressing her now wouldn't help, but at the same time, he couldn't simply ignore what was happening. "Fine, I'll give you that space. But Lucy, know this, you're not alone. You don't have to face this alone." Lucy didn't respond, but something in her expression softened. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to feel the sense of protection Nate was offering, even though she knew that safety could vanish at any moment. As she returned to her room, Nate remained in the hallway, determined to uncover the source of her fear. He knew that to protect Lucy, he would have to go beyond her words and delve into the past she was so desperately trying to keep hidden. Nate felt the time for answers could no longer be postponed. Lucy's growing unease, the mysterious phone call he had partially overheard, and the man at the gala were pieces of a puzzle he had to solve. That morning, while Lucy was occupied with an appointment he had fabricated to keep her temporarily away, Nate decided to act. Using his extensive network, the same one that had always served him loyally in his business dealings, he set out to dig deeply into the life of Lucy Green. He knew she was running from something, and now he was determined to find out what. When the information began to pour in, Nate dove into it. Among the details of her life before ending up on the streets, one name stood out: Arthur Kane, the man from the gala. Nate felt his pulse quicken as he read through the dossier on him. Kane was notorious for his shady dealings, investigations into financial fraud, and rumors of involvement in illegal activities. But what truly caught Nate's attention was Kane's connection to Lucy. Kane wasn't just an acquaintance, he had been her husband. The records outlined a marriage that, on paper, seemed perfect but concealed a dark history. Lucy had come from a wealthy, traditional family, one with a fortune built over generations. When she married Kane, he quickly ingratiated himself into the family's business, manipulating his way into controlling their finances. Things unraveled when Kane got involved in fraudulent schemes, using the Green family name and money to cover his tracks. Desperate to protect her parents' legacy, Lucy tried to confront him, but Kane retaliated. He cut off her access to financial resources, confiscated her credit cards, changed passwords, and isolated her from any support that could help her fight back. What the dossier didn't say, but Nate now understood by piecing it all together, was how this had driven Lucy to the streets. She had fled to save herself, sacrificing everything in the process. Kane, however, had not let her go. That man wanted to regain control, and now, with Lucy living under Nate's roof, he seemed more determined than ever to get to her. That evening, as Nate organized his thoughts, Lucy returned home. She looked visibly exhausted but still carried that air of wariness he now recognized as her constant companion. When she stepped into the living room, he was waiting for her, holding the dossier his investigators had compiled. Lucy froze the moment she saw him, her eyes locking onto the envelope in his hands. No words were needed. She knew exactly what it was. "You looked into my past," she said, her tone a mixture of anger and resignation. "Yes, because you don't trust me enough to tell me yourself." Nate stood, crossing the room to face her. "And now I know what happened. I know who Arthur Kane is." Lucy averted her gaze, her shoulders slumping slightly, as if the weight she had been carrying had finally caught up to her. She knew she couldn't hide the truth anymore. "He ruined my life, Nate. He didn't just take everything I had, he took my freedom. I spent years trapped with him, trying to protect what was left of my family. But it was useless. When I realized he would never let me out of that cycle, I ran. It was my only choice." Nate listened intently, his eyes locked on hers. He had never seen her so vulnerable, but at the same time, he had never admired her strength more. "He's after you, Lucy, and now he knows where you are. You don't have to face this alone." She shook her head, frustrated. "And what can you do? He has connections, power. He's always been a step ahead of me." Nate stepped closer, his voice firm and filled with determination. "You're not running alone anymore. I'll take care of this. He's never going to touch you again, Lucy." She wanted to argue, to tell him he didn't understand what he was up against. But something in Nate's expression stopped her. For the first time, someone was willing to fight alongside her, not out of obligation, but because he truly wanted to protect her. It was both terrifying and comforting. "Nate, this isn't a contract. You don't have to do this for me. I know, he replied, but I want to. Lucy didn't respond. She let the silence fill the space between them. For the first time, she felt that maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to carry this burden alone. And Nate, as he looked at her, knew he was more invested than he had ever planned to be. He didn't just want to protect Lucy. He wanted to save her and, in some way, perhaps save himself too. Nate's determination was unwavering. He knew that taking on someone like Arthur Kane wouldn't be easy. Kane was a powerful man with resources and a cold, calculating nature that made him a dangerous adversary. But Nate wasn't a stranger to high-stakes challenges. He had built an empire by anticipating his competitors' moves and dismantling their strategies before they could take shape. This time, however, it wasn't about business. It was personal. The next morning, Nate called in his most trusted private investigator, a man named Derek, who had worked exclusively for him for years. Derek was discreet, meticulous, and efficient, exactly what Nate needed. He laid out the situation in detail, handing Derek the dossier on Lucy and highlighting the most critical points. Kane's fraudulent schemes, his connections to the criminal underworld, and, most importantly, his obsessive need to keep Lucy under his control. I want everything on him, Derek. Documents, witnesses, anything that can incriminate him. And most importantly, I need to know how he's been tracking Lucy. He found her far too quickly. Someone's helping him, and I want that person identified. Derek nodded, fully understanding the gravity of the request. He had handled difficult cases before, but the intensity in Nate's eyes was unlike anything he'd seen in business dealings. Nate was personally invested, and that made the mission all the more urgent. While Derek began his investigation, Nate took charge of ensuring Lucy's safety. He upgraded the apartment's security, installing state-of-the-art monitoring systems and placing a surveillance team around the building. Lucy watched all of this with a mixture of relief and unease. Although she appreciated Nate's efforts, she feared he was putting himself in too much danger. You don't have to do all of this, Nate. He won't stop, you know that. That's exactly why I'm doing it, Nate replied, his tone resolute. If Kane thinks he can intimidate you or me, he's dead wrong. I'm not the kind of man who backs down. Lucy couldn't suppress a small smile, though it was a tired one, weighed down with worry. She knew Nate was strong, but she also knew what Kane was capable of. The thought that Kane might target Nate unsettled her more than she cared to admit. Days passed as Derek worked tirelessly, and finally, the first pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. He presented Nate with a detailed report, filled with evidence tying Kane to money laundering, bribery, and intimidation schemes. But the most alarming discovery was a mole within Nate's inner circle, someone who had fed information about Lucy and her whereabouts to Kane. He has eyes on you, Nate. Someone close to you is working with him, Derek informed him as Nate pored over the report with a cold, calculating expression. The revelation ignited a quiet fury in Nate. He didn't tolerate betrayal, and now, beyond protecting Lucy, he was determined to root out any threats within his own network. He instructed Derek to identify the traitor, but also began devising his next steps. Gathering evidence against Kane wasn't enough. Nate needed to expose him in a way that left no room for escape. One evening, as Lucy sat on the living room sofa, staring out at the Manhattan skyline, Nate approached. He sat down beside her, his expression serious. Lucy turned to look at him, by now accustomed to the way he took charge of every situation. "What is it, Nate?" she asked, her voice soft but steady. She had come to recognize that look in his eyes, the one that meant he was planning something big. "We have the evidence against Kane," Nate said, his voice calm but brimming with determination. "Fraud, criminal connections, everything. Now we need to plan how to use it." Lucy raised her eyebrows, surprised by how quickly Nate had managed to gather such detailed information. But what surprised her even more was his commitment. He didn't seem focused solely on defeating Kane. He genuinely seemed intent on ensuring her safety. "And what happens now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Now, Lucy, we take him down. For good. The confidence in Nate's words left her momentarily speechless. She knew he was a man of action, but the depth of his dedication touched her in ways she couldn't explain. For the first time in years, she began to believe that she could truly escape Kane's grasp, and it was entirely because of Nate's unwavering determination. As the night wore on, the two of them began discussing the next steps. For the first time, Lucy felt she wasn't fighting alone. Nate was by her side, and though she couldn't yet admit it to herself, it gave her a sense of something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Over the following days, Nate and Lucy worked tirelessly to craft a plan to bring Arthur Kane down. The strategy was bold, dangerous, and meticulously calculated. Nate understood that a man like Kane couldn't be confronted head-on. Kane had influential connections, and despite the evidence they had gathered, it was crucial to act with precision to ensure he couldn't slip through the cracks of the system. The goal was to corner him, leaving no room for escape. Lucy, initially hesitant, decided to take an active role in the plan. She knew her knowledge of Kane's operations was an invaluable asset. She shared everything she knew with Nate: details of his illegal dealings, names of his shady contacts, and even the locations he frequented. It was an act of courage and vulnerability, as each revelation dredged up painful memories of years of manipulation and abuse. Nate listened intently, absorbing every detail, and with each new piece of information, his anger toward Kane grew. The riskiest part of their plan involved a public event where Kane would be present, a charity dinner similar to the one where Lucy had first come face-to-face with him. This time, however, things would be different. Nate secured a critical ally, a prosecutor who had been tracking Kane for years, but had never had enough evidence to prosecute him. With the proof provided by Derek and Lucy's testimony, they finally had a solid case. "He won't know what hit him," Nate said one evening as he reviewed the final details of the plan with Lucy. Lucy watched him, a mix of admiration and apprehension in her eyes. For the first time in a long time, she felt that victory might be within reach. But she also knew that the fight wasn't over. Not yet. And neither she nor Nate could afford to make a single mistake. She watched him for a moment, admiring his calm and focus. Yet deep down, there was a lingering unease she couldn't shake. What if something goes wrong? Kane always finds a way to come out on top. Nate looked directly at her, his voice firm yet laced with an unusual gentleness. "Not this time. Not while I'm here." On the night of the event, Lucy stood by Nate's side once again, wearing an elegant black dress he had chosen for her. Her face appeared composed, but her hands trembled as she held the clutch concealing a small recorder, another key element of the plan. Kane couldn't suspect a thing. He needed to believe that Lucy was alone and vulnerable, exactly the way he had always liked her. When Kane finally arrived, the energy in the room seemed to shift. His presence was commanding, yet there was a predatory air about him, something that made Lucy shrink internally. He spotted her immediately, a cold smile spreading across his face. Nate noticed the look and instinctively placed a hand on Lucy's waist, a subtle but meaningful gesture. "Remember, you're not alone," he whispered in her ear. Kane approached, his voice dripping with cynicism. "Lucy, what a surprise to see you here. And with company, I see." Lucy summoned all the courage she had, keeping her posture steady. Nate observed every move, ready to step in if needed, but he let her take control of this initial exchange. Kane continued, his tone carrying a veiled threat. "I hope you're enjoying life. Shame it doesn't last long. Does it?" Lucy gave a faint smile, but there was a spark in her eyes that Kane didn't notice. He also didn't see Nate discreetly signaling the prosecutor and his team, who were stationed just outside the ballroom, waiting for the perfect moment to act. As Kane spoke, Lucy skillfully guided the conversation toward his past activities. Every word he uttered was being recorded, and Nate, who had an earpiece linked to the prosecutor's team, knew they were gathering exactly what they needed. Lucy, though nervous, kept her composure, subtly provoking Cain until, driven by his own ego, he began to admit to things he should never have said in public. Finally, the moment arrived. The prosecutor entered the ballroom flanked by 2 police officers. Cain noticed too late. They announced his arrest loudly, and the entire room fell silent, turning to watch the scene unfold. Cain tried to argue, but the evidence was undeniable. The recordings and documents incriminated him beyond any doubt. He shot a furious glare at Lucy, but she didn't flinch. For the first time, she stood her ground, meeting his gaze as an equal. Nate stood beside her as Cain was handcuffed and escorted out. Lucy felt a wave of relief mixed with disbelief. For years, she had believed she would never be free of that man. But now, thanks to Nate's determination and the courage she had discovered within herself, Cain was finally out of her life. As the room began to return to normal, Nate led Lucy to a quieter corner. He held her hands, looking directly into her eyes. "It's over, Lucy. You're safe now." She didn't respond immediately, but for the first time in years, she felt the weight of fear and suffering begin to lift. And in that moment, as she looked at Nate, she realized she wasn't just safe. She was starting to believe in something she thought she had lost forever: hope for a future. Arthur Cain's arrest triggered a wave of changes that Lucy could hardly believe she was experiencing. In the days that followed, she felt, for the first time in years, the freedom to breathe without the constant weight of a looming threat. Nate's apartment, which had once felt like a temporary refuge, was now beginning to feel like a space where she could truly feel secure. But what surprised her most was Nate's unwavering presence by her side throughout every step of the process. He wasn't just supporting her. He was deeply committed to helping her rebuild her life. One of the first things Lucy decided to do was reclaim her family's legacy. The green fortune, once managed and partially squandered by Cain, still held assets and investments that could be restored. With Nate's help, his team of lawyers working tirelessly at her disposal, Lucy began reviewing every detail of the documents that had previously been out of her reach. It was a long and emotionally draining process, but with each small victory, Lucy felt like she was rebuilding more than just material wealth. She was reclaiming her dignity. Nate, on the other hand, watched Lucy with growing admiration. He had met a woman who seemed fragile, broken by her circumstances, but now he saw someone strong, resilient, and capable of facing her fears head-on and fighting for what was hers. With every meeting with the lawyers, every decision about her family's business, Lucy revealed a sharp intelligence and an unwavering determination that inspired him. He found himself increasingly fascinated by her, not just for who she was becoming, but for who she had always been, despite a world that had tried to erase her. On a sunny day, Nate accompanied Lucy to one of the Green family properties, a historic mansion on the outskirts of New York that had been abandoned for years. As they entered the house, she stopped in the grand entry hall, where sunlight filtered through dusty stained glass windows, casting colorful patterns on the floor. Lucy looked around, taking in every detail. To her, this place was more than just a building. It was a symbol of everything she had lost and now had the chance to reclaim. "This place belonged to my mother," she said, her voice soft but laden with emotion. "She loved this house. She always said it was where our family truly came together." Nate stayed silent, giving her space to reconnect with those memories. He understood that, no matter how much he wanted to help, this moment was hers alone. Lucy walked through the space, running her fingers along the walls, glancing at the furniture covered in white sheets, and finally stopping by a window. When she turned to Nate, tears shimmered in her eyes, but there was also something more, a quiet determination. "I want to bring this back. Not just the house, but everything it represents. I want this place to be what it once was, not just for me, but for others." Nate offered a small smile, crossing his arms as he watched her. "Then we'll make it happen. You have everything you need to make this a reality, Lucy. And if you need help, I'll be here." She nodded, touched by the sincerity in his words. Even though she was discovering strength within herself, it was comforting to know she didn't have to face everything alone. The months that followed were marked by progress and growth. Lucy, now more confident than ever, took full control of her family's business, restoring its reputation in the market. At the same time, she found a deeper purpose, helping other women who had faced struggles similar to her own. Inspired by her journey, she decided to transform part of the Green Mansion into a support center for women in vulnerable situations, offering shelter, legal resources, and training to help them rebuild their lives. Nate stood by her side every step of the way. He watched Lucy blossom, becoming not just a woman who had overcome her past, but someone who used her experiences to make a difference in the lives of others. And as he saw her so determined, so full of purpose, something inside him began to shift. For the first time, Nate, a man who had always lived solely for himself, started to feel that maybe his life could hold a greater meaning. On a quiet evening, as the two of them sat on the mansion's terrace, gazing at the city lights in the distance, Nate finally voiced what he had been feeling. "You know, Lucy, when I first met you, I thought you were just part of a bet, something temporary. But now, I can't imagine my life without you." Lucy turned to him, surprised by his words. She had sensed something growing between them, but hearing it from Nate, a man so reserved and controlled, made it different. It made it real. "Nate, I don't know how to thank you for what you've done for me, for believing in me, even when I doubted myself." He shook his head, smiling gently. "You don't have to thank me, Lucy. You did this. All I did was stand beside you. I didn't do this because I had to, Lucy. I did it because you deserve it. And because, somehow, it changed me too." She looked at him for a long moment, letting his words settle. For the first time, she felt like she wasn't just living through a new chapter. She was beginning a new life. A life that, in some way, included Nate in ways she had never expected. The days following the transformation of the Green Mansion into a support center for women in vulnerable situations brought a renewed energy to both Lucy and Nate. What initially seemed like Lucy's way of reclaiming a piece of her past quickly grew into something much greater. The first women began arriving, each with their own story of hardship, and Lucy poured her heart into them with a compassion rooted in her own experiences. She wasn't just leading the project. She was there, listening, guiding, and above all, offering hope. Nate watched it all with quiet admiration. He became involved in practical ways, helping to raise funds and leveraging his corporate connections to support the initiative. But more than that, he began to realize he was finding purpose in something he had never imagined. For the first time, his skills in negotiation and leadership were being used for something beyond profit or status. He saw the direct impact the project was having, and at the same time, he saw Lucy thriving as she embraced this role. One sunny afternoon, as Lucy walked across the mansion grounds, overseeing some renovations, Nate approached her. He was casually dressed, something that had become more common for him in recent months as the seriousness of his business persona began to make room for a lighter side he didn't know he had. He observed her for a few moments before speaking, admiring the way she interacted with everyone, from the architect overseeing the work to the women who were beginning to call the mansion home. "You know, I never thought I'd be using my influence for something like this," he said, a crooked smile forming as he got closer. Lucy turned to him, holding a clipboard, her eyes shining with the spark that had become her trademark. "Are you complaining about it?" she asked, a playful smile on her lips. Nate shook his head, chuckling softly. "No. In fact, I think I've never been more satisfied with anything in my life. And that's strange for me." Lucy looked at him for a moment, her smile softening. "You've changed, Nate, and I don't think it's just because of this." He tilted his head, thoughtful, as though he were processing her words. After a moment, he responded, "Maybe, but I think it was you who changed me, Lucy. When I met you, all I saw was a bet. I was blind to everything that really mattered. But getting to know you, really know you, made me see the world differently. I don't know how, but you've transformed me." Lucy felt an unexpected warmth bloom in her chest. Nate's words were sincere, and they touched her deeply. She knew the man standing before her wasn't the same one who had approached her on the streets months ago. He had learned to see beyond appearances, to care deeply. But what amazed her most was that, in helping her, he seemed to be healing from something she still didn't fully understand. "I only showed you what was already there," she said with a gentle smile. "You just needed a reason to see it." Nate took a step closer, and Lucy felt her heart skip slightly. He looked into her eyes, his expression serious yet carrying something far deeper. "And now I see that, even though this started as something meaningless, all of it, us, this project, everything we've built together, has become the most important thing in my life." Lucy blinked, surprised by the intensity of his words. A lump formed in her throat, but she managed to smile. "And what are you going to do about that, Nate?" He smiled back, but there was a resolve in his eyes that made her feel like something significant was about to happen. "I want to stay by your side, Lucy. Not just to support what you're doing, but to be part of it with you. Together, we can go even further. I don't want this to end. I want to build something that lasts, something that makes a difference. With you." Lucy didn't respond immediately. She was taking it all in, feeling the depth of what Nate was saying. He wasn't just a changed man. He was someone who saw in her more than she ever believed possible. And, somehow, that made her start to believe there might be room for something more between them. Something real. As the sun began to set, the two stood there, side by side, gazing out at the grounds of the mansion that had become a symbol of renewal. Not just for the women finding refuge there, but for them as well. Lucy knew there was still so much to build, both within the project and in the relationship slowly forming between them. But for the first time, she felt they were on the right path. And that, in itself, was more than she had dared to dream. The end of the year arrived, bringing with it the official inauguration of the support center for women at the Green Mansion. The day was sunny, though the crisp air hinted at the approaching winter. Lucy oversaw the final preparations with a sense of fulfillment she had never experienced before. The flowers were impeccably arranged, the lights glowed warmly, and the once neglected grounds now seemed alive again. The mansion was filled with guests. Women who had been helped by the project, philanthropists who had supported the cause, and even prominent figures from society, all gathered to celebrate what Lucy and Nate had built together. Lucy wore a simple yet elegant white dress, a reflection of the new chapter in her life. She had fought hard to get to where she was, and every step she took carried the weight of the battles she had won. As she greeted the guests, her attention turned to Nate, who was engaged in a lively conversation with some of the donors. He looked sharp in a dark blue suit, but there was something different about his demeanor. Nate seemed lighter, more human. He was no longer the arrogant man who believed money could buy anything. He was a partner, someone who had become part of this journey for reasons far beyond pride or status. When it was time for the speech, Lucy stepped onto the small stage set up in the garden. The murmur of conversation ceased, and all eyes turned to her. Lucy took a deep breath, feeling a mix of nerves and emotion. Nate stood among the guests, watching her with a gaze that seemed to bolster her courage. "Today is not just the opening of a center," she began, her voice strong yet filled with emotion. "It's a celebration of new chances, of all the times we thought it was the end, only to find the strength to start again. This place isn't just mine. It belongs to every woman who has had to fight against adversity, who has risen even when the world seemed to be against her." Soft applause rippled through the crowd, but Lucy wasn't finished. Her eyes found Nate's, and she decided it was time to say what had been weighing on her heart. And none of this would have been possible without the help of someone who, at first, I didn't fully understand. Someone who believed in me even when I couldn't believe in myself. Nate Hartfield, you didn't just help me rebuild my life. You showed me that even after years of pain, it's possible to trust again. Thank you for being more than a partner. Thank you for being the reason I'm here today." The silence was broken by warm applause, but Nate didn't move right away. He simply stood there, looking at her as though her words had affirmed everything he had been feeling. When Lucy stepped down from the stage, Nate walked straight to her, ignoring the crowd around them. He took her hands, as if the rest of the world had disappeared. "You've always been incredible, Lucy. I just helped show that to the world," he said, his voice low and filled with sincerity. Lucy smiled, a smile brimming with emotion, and for the first time, she let the walls around her heart fall completely. "I never thought I could love again, Nate. I never thought I deserved to, but you changed everything." Before she could say more, Nate gently pulled her closer, his eyes locked on hers. The kiss that followed wasn't impulsive. It was deliberate, meaningful. It was the culmination of months of challenges, of shared growth that had transformed a cold, calculated bet into something profoundly genuine. The crowd around them, caught off guard, broke into applause once again, but Lucy and Nate didn't care. In that moment, the world around them faded away. All that mattered was that they had found each other. When they finally pulled apart, Nate still held her hands, looking at her with a mixture of admiration and joy. "This is just the beginning, Lucy. We have so much to build together." She nodded, her eyes glistening. "And this time we'll build it together, no matter what comes our way." As the sun began to set, casting golden hues over the garden, Lucy and Nate stood side by side, gazing toward a future that now seemed brighter than ever. They hadn't just overcome their pasts. They had transformed their pain into something beautiful, something that not only bound them together, but also made a difference in the lives of so many others. What had started as a wager had grown into something far greater. The beginning of a new life, built on love, courage, and the unwavering certainty that, together, they could face anything. If you enjoyed this video, let us know in the comments. Your opinion is very important to us. Don't forget to subscribe. A big hug, and see you in the next video.